the good son. As Bobby played in the farm, he must have been about 6 years old. He stumbled and fell into the dry water well that had been abandoned for years. It was a stormy day, and as soon as Bobby fell into the well, a thunderous lightning descended into the well, hundreds of times faster than Bobby was falling. At the bottom of the well, the lighting intertwined into a cushion of energy, preventing Bobby from badly hurting himself. Nevertheless, he spent several weeks in a coma, until one day he just opened his eyes like nothing had happened. This is the story of the Robinson family, set in rural America during the 1930s, in a small farming town just outside Springfield, Illinois. The Robinsons, a family of 7 boys, lived on a farm that seemed to always be in turmoil. The boys were always fighting, causing mischief, and getting into trouble. Except for Robert. Robert, or Bobby as his family called him, was different. He was the 3rd oldest of the Robinson boys, a bit of a gentle soul amidst all the chaos. He had always been the kind, more friendly brother who tried to keep peace even when the world around him seemed intent on causing trouble. He would often be found wandering the farm, daydreaming, or playing with the animals, trying to escape the endless bickering that marked the lives of his siblings. The Robinsons were sworn enemies of their neighbors, the Smiths, a family whose feuds with the Robinsons had stretched across generations. The cause of their animosity was never clear, just one of those deep-rooted hatreds that you grew up with, that you inherited, whether you understood it or not. It was on a warm summer afternoon that Bobby found himself caught in the middle of one of these bitter family conflicts, one that would change his life and his family's fate forever. The 2 oldest brothers, Thomas and Robert, had gone into town to spend the afternoon at the local general store. It was a regular outing. They would get a few soda pops, chat with the other kids in town, and enjoy the warmth of a summer day. Everything seemed peaceful. But that afternoon, the calm was shattered. 4 of the Smith boys, big, hulking teenagers, appeared out of nowhere. They had been waiting behind some nearby buildings. They ambushed Thomas, who, at 13 years old, wasn't yet old enough to stand up to the aggression of the Smiths. What started as a verbal altercation quickly escalated into a violent brawl. Before Bobby could even understand what was happening, the situation turned deadly. One of the Smith boys, in a fit of rage, pulled a knife and stabbed Thomas. He was only 10 years old, but that didn't matter. The blade sunk deep, and within moments, Thomas was on the ground, lifeless. The Smiths scattered, leaving him behind like an animal carcass, and Bobby, full of rage and terror, fled back home, desperate to tell the family. He burst through the door, screaming, his voice trembling with fear. "Tommy's dead!" he cried. His father and brothers didn't waste a moment. They grabbed their coats and rushed back to town, leaving Bobby alone in the house. Alone in the house with his guilt. The sight of his brother lying in the dirt, cold and lifeless, haunted Bobby. The pain and guilt gnawed at him. He wished it had been him. He wished he could take Tommy's place. In the heat of the moment, Bobby made his way back to the old abandoned water well near the back of the property, a well that had not been used in years. The well had become a place of escape for him in the past, a place to think when things got too overwhelming. He'd fallen into it once as a child, 20 feet deep, but something strange had happened that day. As he fell, a bolt of lightning had struck the well, faster than Bobby had been falling. The lightning, with a force beyond reason, had somehow cushioned his fall, preventing him from injury. He hadn't understood it then, and he didn't understand it now, but it was the one thing in his life that had ever felt out of his control, something that felt connected to a higher force. So Bobby went to the well that day, feeling like there was nothing left to live for. He stood on the edge and looked down into its depths, contemplating the end. With a heavy heart, he whispered the words that had been tormenting him. "I wish it had been me." And as soon as the words left his lips, a violent lightning bolt struck the well once more. The electricity crackled through the air, and Bobby, feeling an inexplicable force overcome him, collapsed to the ground, his body now stabbed and covered in blood. Meanwhile, back in town, Bobby's family found that Thomas had somehow survived. He was bruised and battered with no stabbing wounds and alive, sitting on the porch of a local house, his life spared. The Smiths had fled, not wanting to deal with the aftermath. Confused and relieved, Bobby's family took Thomas back home, thinking nothing of Bobby's disappearance. They assumed he was lying, perhaps making up stories to get attention. But when they returned home, they found Bobby in the backyard, bloodied and near death. The local doctor was called in a hurry, but it was unclear how Bobby had been injured. He had been nowhere near the fight. His family, trying to make sense of what had happened, had no answers. The cycle of violence continued. The hatred between the Robinsons and the Smiths reached a boiling point. Years of animosity had led to this, a terrible confrontation. It was a day that the town would never forget. Gunfire erupted, loud and brutal. The two families, locked in a bloody battle, fought to the death. Men, women, and children fell to the ground, either shot or mortally wounded. The streets ran red with blood, and yet, in the middle of it all, there stood Bobby, untouched, unharmed. He had become something of a ghost by this point, a boy who had absorbed so much suffering and pain that he had been transformed. No longer the innocent child, Bobby had become a symbol of sacrifice, of something greater than all of them, whether they knew it or not. He ran back to the well for what he hoped would be the last time. The destruction around him, the gunshots, the screams, it all felt so hopeless. But Bobby, with his heart broken from the years of conflict, uttered the same words again. "I wish it had been me." As soon as those words escaped his lips, the storm that had been raging above responded. A massive bolt of lightning descended from the sky, and Bobby fell to the ground once more, bloodied, shot, and broken. But this time, something strange happened. All the people who had fallen, who had died in that terrible fight, began to rise. They stood, unharmed, as if nothing had happened. The dead walked again, their wounds healed, as they all stared at Bobby in awe, unable to comprehend what had just occurred. The lightning surged again, and Bobby was enveloped in a brilliant cloud of light. He was carried away into the sky, drawn into the heart of the storm. The sound of thunder echoed in the distance, as Bobby was lifted higher and higher. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, it was over. Years passed, and the feud between the Robinsons and the Smiths was finally laid to rest. The hatred that had consumed both families for generations evaporated with Bobby's sacrifice. The two families, having lost so much, finally realized how pointless the violence had been, how it had destroyed everything they had once held dear. The townspeople would speak of that day for years, telling the story of the boy who had been touched by the storm. But the one who would remember it most was Tommy, Bobby's older brother, who would live to be 87 years old. In his final years, Tommy sat on his porch, his old bones aching, his mind filled with memories of his youth. The family had long since gone, his brothers, his parents, but Tommy still carried with him the weight of everything that had happened. The grief, the guilt, the anger. He had lived with it all, watching his family slowly disband, the tragedy of it all never quite leaving him. One day, as the sun dipped low over the fields, Tommy began to tell his story to the children in town. His voice was raspy, but his words were filled with the wisdom of a man who had lived a lifetime with the memories of his lost brother. "I was there," he said, looking out across the fields, his eyes distant. "I saw it all. I saw what Bobby did, what he went through. I never understood it then, but I do now. He was the good son, the one who carried all of our pain. He was the one who saved us, even if it cost him his life." The children listened in silence, feeling the weight of the old man's words. Tommy paused, as if searching for the right way to explain what he felt. "Bobby didn't deserve what happened to him. None of us did, but he saved us. In the end, that boy, he saved us all." And as Tommy finished his story, the sun set behind the old farmhouse, casting long shadows across the land. He never did say whether he felt guilty or grateful for what Bobby had done. Maybe it was both. But in his heart, Tommy knew one thing for certain. Bobby had taken their pain with him. And in that moment, as the storm rumbled in the distance, Tommy felt at peace.